All right. So what happens if we put a tariff on? Okay. What happens if we put a tariff on? So this is the wheat market, right? This is, I know you're like, yeah, this. Remember this? This is this. So the world price for wheat's $3. It pulls, U.S. pulls the price down to $3. We get a decline in U.S. wheat production, an increase in U.S. wheat consumption. With the imports, consumers are better off, farmers are worse off, blah, blah, blah. Okay? So this is this. What happens if we put a tariff on? So let's suppose that the U.S. government puts a tax onto wheat that raises the price to $4. Right there. So now wheat is $4. Well, at $4, Americans are going to consume less wheat, and U.S. farmers are going to grow more wheat. Right? So U.S. production of wheat goes up. U.S. consumption of wheat goes down. The total amount of imports, which is the difference between the supply curve and the demand curve, on the brown line, is lower than what it was on the red line. So the U.S., because of the tariff, U.S. farmers are better off. They're producing more at higher prices. U.S. consumers are worse off. They're getting less and paying higher prices for less, and we've restricted imports. Okay? This creates what economists call a deadweight loss. There's a net loss to society because of what happens to the American consumers. Okay? We made the consumers worse off so we could help out the producers. Exciting. So consumers are worse off, farmers are better off. The consumers losing more than the farmers are gaining. Society is worse off. Okay? Exciting. Okay. A quota. So the U.S. has quotas on how much, well, Canada has quotas on how much dairy. I wrote that backwards, right? So Canada limits how much dairy from the U.S. can come into Canada. The U.S. limits how much lumber can come in from Canada. So that's actually dairy to Canada, but we actually have restrictions back on them because. So we have a free trade agreement. We have NAFTA. Because of NAFTA, we can't tax all this stuff, so we put quotas in place. Okay? We limit dairy that moves back and forth across the border. We limit lumber that comes back and forth across the border. On the other hand, Honda has a factory that they make Civics in Canada, in Toronto. Those Civics can come into the United States and don't pay any taxes. In fact, if you look, next time you go buy a car, if you've never done this before, when you buy a car, there's a sticker on your car that says domestic content. Okay? It's what percent of your car was made here in America. It's supposed to be in the old NAFTA, it was 62.5%. If the car had 62.5% North American parts, it could avoid tariffs, and now it's going to be 75% if they pass that deal. But you can read that sticker. Domestic U.S. content includes Canada. So when it says this car was built, 65% in the U.S., that includes Canada, like they're the 51st state, okay? Because we have this free trade agreement. And again, we put limits on beef from Argentina. If you go to most restaurants in the United States, they'll tell you, if you go out to restaurants in Hawaii and order a hamburger, they'll say, oh, this is local beef. And you're like, yes, Hawaiian beef, aloha. Okay? If you go out in Colorado, you're pretty sure that most of the burgers and steaks you're getting are locally grown. Right? A stupid story, but I'm going to tell you anyhow. When I was a little kid, my parents took me and my sisters out, and we played at this farm all day. We swam in the lake, and hung out in this farm. And then as we were leaving, they said, "Which cow do you like?" And we all pointed to this one cow and go, "That's the cute cow." Well, unfortunately, that cow showed up sliced up and frozen and was put in our fridge not long after that. We were very upset about that because his mom made us pick the cow that then got killed. But McDonald's, on the other hand, so the fancy restaurants are going to tell you it's all Colorado beef. And when I worked at Burger King when I was a kid, we got fresh Colorado beef delivered every morning at Burger King. Now, the Burger Kings, the McDonald's, all they'll tell you is their beef is North American beef or it's Western Hemisphere beef. They won't promise you that what they're getting is U.S. beef. And mostly the beef that they get isn't even a cut of beef, it's the trimmings. So when they cut the cow apart and they cut out the steaks and cut out all this, they have extra stuff left over. And that's what you're eating at McDonald's. Okay? But we put limits on imports of beef from other countries because we want U.S. restaurants to serve U.S. beef. It's a political thing. Okay? All right. Quotas are just like tariffs. The effect of a quota is exactly like the effect of the tariff. We're going to pay higher prices because now, instead of the tax raising the price, the quota limits how much we can import. That raises the price because there's a lower quantity supplied. So, but the net effect of that quota is the same as the net effect of the tariff. It's going to raise the price. It's going to lower imports. Consumers are worse off. U.S. farmers are better off. The loss to consumers is bigger than the gain by the farmers, and poof, society is worse off. Okay. So health and safety rules. Sometimes health and safety rules are really health and safety rules, right? We want the beef that comes in from Argentina to be, taken care of in a way that we're pretty sure there's nothing bad about it and we're not going to die when we eat it. On the other hand, sometimes these health and safety rules are just used as an excuse. So there was an outbreak of mad cow disease, bovine encephalitis, in England, and the United States stopped imports of beef from Western Canada. And I'm like, do they think that the Canadian cows are going on vacation to England and picking up mad cow disease while they're there? Why would you think that if there's an outbreak of mad cow disease, you should cut off cattle imports from Canada? Okay? It's something that made American beef producers happy, but probably really wasn't, right, a thing. We do the same thing with things like shoes. So we want to make sure that Italian shoes that come to the U.S. are expensive shoes, not cheap shoes. So we have requirements like how thick the leather has to be and that kind of thing, which we're saying, well, that's for the safety of the American consumer. But really, it's to protect people who make shoes, American companies that make shoes. So when you buy cheap shoes, maybe they're American cheap shoes, not Italian cheap shoes. Cheap. Licenses. To import and export from most countries in the world, you have to have a license. Okay? Japan is famous for getting rid of all their tariffs and everything else, and then telling you have to have a license, and then taking 5 years or 10 years to process the license. So Japan stopped U.S. computer companies when PCs first came out. Japan basically stopped U.S. companies from selling PCs, selling desktop computers and laptops into Japan so that Japanese people had to buy Japanese-made computers. And they didn't do it with tariffs, and they didn't do it with quotas, and they didn't do it, right? They did it by putting in license requirements. So you'd want to sell a computer to somebody, you have to tell them they have to wait 5 years until you get the license. Well, they're not waiting 5 years for you to get that license. Okay? And the license only applies to the sale you wanted to make. Now you don't want to make that sale anymore, so now you need a new license. Right? It's a very effective way of controlling trade is to require these licenses and then mess around with the licenses. Yeah? Okay. Ownership restrictions. In countries like Japan and China, U.S. citizens are not allowed to own businesses. Let me say that again. In countries like Japan and China, U.S. citizens are not allowed to own businesses. So for General Motors to operate in China, they have to have Chinese partners. So General Motors sells Buicks in China, but most of the cars they sell in China, or many of the cars they sell in China, are other brands. They're Chinese branded because they have to have a Chinese partner to work with them to sell vehicles. Same thing in Japan. Ford used to own a chunk of Mazda. They can't own all of Mazda. Renault owns half of, which is a French company, owns half of Nissan. Yes, Renault owns half of Nissan. They're not allowed to own all of Nissan. Okay? Because that's the rules. That means that Japanese companies and Chinese companies, when they partner with that U.S. company, they get to figure out that company's technology. They get to learn how that company does business. China is in the starting up the business of building airplanes of their very own, commercial airplanes. So one day you might ride on an airliner that's made in China. How'd they learn to do that? Well, Airbus built a factory in China. They had to have Chinese partners. Those Chinese partners learned everything about building airplanes from Airbus, and they went off and designed and are now building their own airplanes. Okay? The U.S. does not have ownership restrictions, except foreign folks are not allowed to own U.S. airlines, and they're not allowed to own the media in the U.S., except for Fox. Fox has an exception. So Fox is actually owned by Rupert Murdoch, who's Australian, right? But all the other TV networks and TV stations and radio stations and newspapers in the United States are owned by U.S. citizens. Okay? So other than airlines and the media, we don't have restrictions on ownership in the United States where these other countries do. Okay? Fine. Countries manipulate their exchange rate. We're going to talk about that a little bit now, and then we'll talk about that more later. Now meaning in this chapter, but not right now, but soon. China is famous for doing this. Donald Trump said during the campaign that the day he became president, he was going to declare China a currency manipulator. It took him 2.5 years, and he did it for a couple of days, and then he backed off. It's all interesting and fascinating, and we'll talk about it more and more and more as time goes on. But if we want to buy something from Japan, we have to trade our dollars in for their yen, and then we go buy it, and we pay for it in yen. If the dollar can buy a whole bunch of yen, that makes the Japanese product inexpensive. If the dollar hardly buys any yen, then that makes Japanese products expensive. Think that through. We'll talk about that again. Countries also subsidize their exports. So there used to be a whole bunch of family wheat farmers all over Africa, and there aren't hardly any anymore. And the reason is that the taxpayers in Europe pay the farmers in Europe. So all of the wheat farmers in Europe who want to sell to Africa, they actually sell the wheat into Africa below the cost of growing wheat. And the difference is made up by the taxpayers. So the family wheat farmer in Africa is not only competing against the European wheat farmer, they're competing against the European taxpayers. And the price of wheat dropped really low in Africa, and all these wheat farmers got out. Were driven out of business. The EU has actually made nice full-color brochures about how, we're nice people and we are helping Africa and blah, blah, blah. And nobody really buys that. Okay? The airplane on here is this giant, they realized it was a mistake to go this way, but Airbus spent all this money to design and build this giant double-decker A380 airplane. The development costs were something like $7 billion, which Airbus did not have to pay. The governments of all these countries in Europe that are part of the Airbus consortium, there's 7 of them that are part of this Airbus company, they paid for it. It was taxpayer paid for, not company paid for. The U.S. complains constantly to the World Trade Organization, we'll talk about them in a minute, about Airbus being subsidized by the taxpayers, and every time we do that, Airbus loses because the subsidies they get are not supposed to happen under our trade agreements. On the other hand, Boeing, we don't give Boeing money directly, we give them money indirectly, and we do that by saying if Boeing wants to sell an airplane to a Thailand airline, okay, the U.S. government will arrange the loan at very low or zero interest rates. So the U.S. government subsidizes the financing of Boeing airplane sales outside the United States. Okay? And the Europeans, of course, complain about that to us, and we're kind of losers. Got that? So countries distort the export market by paying their producers to make things cheaper.